Jason and Sarah Collins were the image of marital perfection. Neighbors often said their house looked like a page from a magazine. 2 kids, a dog, and a couple who seemed inseparable. Jason, a 38-year-old independent contractor, was the kind of man who waved at every passing car and offered to mow the neighbor's lawn without being asked. Sarah, a 34-year-old stay-at-home mom, ran the PDA, baked cupcakes for every school fundraiser, and never missed Sunday service. To the outside world, their life seemed simple, wholesome, even enviable. Jason had built their 2-story home with his own hands. It stood proudly on the corner lot of Cedar Grove Avenue, painted in soft blues with a welcoming porch swing, where he and Sarah would sit in the evenings with a glass of wine. Inside, family photos lined the hallway. The kids' school portraits, birthday parties, and vacation snapshots in frames that looked hand-picked with love. They had met 12 years earlier at a hardware store of all places. Sarah was shopping for a showerhead, and Jason was working part-time there before launching his own business. He liked to joke that it was love at first leak. She laughed every time. From that day on, they were nearly inseparable. They married within a year. 2 children came soon after, Maddie, now 10, and Trevor, 8. Jason had scaled his contracting business into a modestly successful enterprise, with loyal clients and positive reviews. Sarah focused on raising the children, supporting Jason's growing business, and organizing school and church events. She was well-liked, even loved, by nearly everyone in their community. But picture-perfect homes can hide the ugliest cracks. Underneath the smiles and picture frames, something was festering. A quiet kind of discontent that no one outside their 4 walls seemed to notice, or maybe didn't want to see. Jason worked long hours, sometimes 6 days a week. The physical strain of construction wore on him. His hands were often blistered, his back ached, and sleep was irregular. The stress of managing clients, late invoices, subcontractors, and inspections weighed heavily on him. Sarah, meanwhile, was growing resentful. She missed her husband's attention, his time, and the way he used to look at her like she was the center of his world. She didn't say it outright, but she felt invisible. Arguments began. They were small at first, over missed dinners, over Jason forgetting to pick up milk, over Sarah spending too much on clothes for the kids. Typical stuff. But the frequency increased. The volume, too. Jason was the kind of man who hated yelling. He preferred silence. When Sarah raised her voice, he'd leave the room. When she cried, he'd freeze. He wasn't cruel, just emotionally unavailable. He had learned somewhere along the way that men don't cry, don't whine, don't talk about feelings. And Sarah? She needed words. Affection. Affirmation. Love notes, small surprises, validation. Instead, she got distance. There was no cheating, no drinking, no visible abuse. But something unspoken hung in the air. A slow erosion, like a house with a cracked foundation. Beautiful on the outside, dangerous beneath the surface. Then came the financial strain. In 2011, one of Jason's biggest clients filed for bankruptcy and refused to pay for a 6-month job. Jason took the hit personally. Bills piled up. He took on smaller jobs to stay afloat. Sarah worried. The credit cards ballooned. The mortgage payment was late twice. Their arguments shifted. Now money was the primary fuel. Jason accused Sarah of spending too much. Sarah said Jason was mismanaging the business. It was around this time that Sarah began spending more time at the gym. At first, Jason encouraged it. He thought it was great she was taking care of herself. But then she started dressing differently. Tighter yoga pants, low-cut tanks, new perfume. She began texting more, and when Jason asked who it was, she shrugged it off. He didn't push. He trusted her. The neighbors never saw bruises. No one ever called the cops. But sometimes, if you listened closely, you'd hear muffled yelling behind closed doors. One neighbor, Mrs. Ellsworth, remembered hearing loud thumps once, like furniture being knocked over, followed by the slam of a door. But when she checked, Sarah smiled and waved, as though nothing had happened. Then came the church retreat. Sarah went alone. Jason stayed home with the kids. It was a 3-day spiritual gathering for wives and mothers. When she returned, she seemed different. Calmer, yes, but colder too. She stopped arguing. She stopped crying. She was no longer asking for Jason's attention, or anything at all. Instead, she seemed to float through the house, robotic. Her smile was forced, her eyes unfocused. Jason didn't know it then, but something had shifted inside her. And then, just 2 months later, everything changed. On a cold February night, the police showed up at Jason's door. Sarah had called 911. She told them Jason had tried to strangle her after a heated argument about the mortgage. She had bruises on her neck, red marks on her arm. The kids were asleep. Jason was arrested on the spot. He didn't resist. He was too stunned to speak. He kept repeating, "I didn't touch her. I swear to God." Sarah's story was chilling. She claimed Jason snapped, that he grabbed her by the throat and slammed her into the wall, that she barely escaped. The police took photos. The bruises were real. She cried during her statement, told officers she feared for her life and her children's safety. She said it wasn't the first time, that he'd always had a temper. Jason insisted it was all a lie. He said he had come home from work, had dinner, and went to bed early. There was no fight, no violence. He said Sarah had been acting strange for months. Cold, distant, distracted. But he never thought she'd go this far. He was charged with felony domestic assault and attempted strangulation. Within 48 hours, a restraining order barred him from returning home or seeing his kids. His lawyer advised a plea deal, but Jason refused. He wanted to fight. He wanted to clear his name. The trial would come months later. But the damage was already done. The perfect marriage, the one that smiled in Christmas cards, sat together at PTA meetings, and kissed on their front porch, had crumbled into dust. And nobody saw it coming, except Sarah. Because maybe, just maybe, she had been planning it all along. The courtroom was colder than Jason expected. Not just in temperature, but in tone. Like the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of every ruined life that had passed through its doors. He sat stiffly beside his public defender, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Jason's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief. He still couldn't wrap his mind around it. How the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, had painted him as a monster. The prosecutor stood with calm certainty. The state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Jason Collins is a danger to his wife and children. That on February 3rd, he violently attacked his wife, Sarah Collins, in their home. That this is not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a pattern of domestic violence that Sarah had endured in silence for years. Jason's jaw clenched. Lies. All of it. Sarah sat across from him, behind the witness table, dressed in a conservative blue blouse and minimal makeup. She looked nothing like the woman he had shared a bed with for nearly a decade. She looked rehearsed, hardened. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched a tissue, and she avoided Jason's gaze completely. When it was time for her to testify, her voice cracked with emotion. She told the jury how Jason had changed over the years, how he had gone from being sweet and attentive to controlling and angry. She said he didn't want her to leave the house, didn't let her spend money, and grew jealous if she talked to other men. She spoke of isolation, of fear, of emotional and physical abuse that no one else had seen. "I was afraid to speak up," she said through tears. "I didn't want to break up our family. I kept hoping he'd change. But that night, he snapped. I thought he was going to kill me." Jason's attorney tried to push back. There were no police reports before this incident. No witnesses. No hospital visits. No prior accusations of abuse. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Collins, that this is the first time you've ever claimed Jason physically hurt you?" Sarah answered softly, "Yes, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen." The prosecution then introduced photographs. Red marks on her neck, faint bruises on her arm. They brought in a medical expert who said the injuries were consistent with manual strangulation. The photos were damning. The bruises real. Jason had no idea how they got there. The defense attempted to introduce character witnesses. Friends, neighbors, co-workers who all testified Jason was a kind man, a calm man. someone who wouldn't hurt a fly. But the prosecution countered with the classic line, "Abusers don't abuse in public." Then came the most crushing blow. Sarah had kept a journal. Or at least that's what she said. Pages and pages of handwritten entries, allegedly documenting years of abuse, some physical, some emotional. There were entries that described Jason yelling at her, grabbing her wrist, threatening to take the kids away, her handwriting, her words, and none of them had ever been shared until now. Jason stared at the pages in disbelief. He had never said those things, never done those things, but in the eyes of the jury, the evidence looked overwhelming. A trembling wife, a tear-streaked face, photos of injuries, a secret journal of alleged horrors, a husband with calloused hands, a temper under stress, and no alibi. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. Guilty. Jason Collins was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink when the sentence was read. He sat still, like someone frozen in time, unable to grasp that his life had just been torn in half. The gavel came down, and with it, so did his world. He was led away in handcuffs. He caught one final glimpse of Sarah. She sat still, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. But there was no visible sadness, no remorse, only a strange calm, like the eye of a storm that had finally passed. Jason was placed in a medium-security prison in Chillicothe, Ohio. His first year was a blur of cold beds, strict routines, and constant paranoia. He was the wife-beater, the monster who hurt a mother. He kept to himself, learned the rules quickly, and avoided trouble. But the mental toll was unbearable. He wrote letters to his kids every month. They were never answered. He filed for appeals, spent hours in the law library trying to understand his case. But nothing moved. He was just another number in the system now. And all the while he couldn't stop thinking, why? Why would Sarah lie? Why would she destroy their family, take him away from his children, and send him to rot in prison? Then, one day, 2 years into his sentence, Jason got a letter. Not from Sarah. Not from his kids. From someone he barely remembered. It was from a former neighbor, Wendy Mercer, a single mom who lived across the street during the time of his arrest. Her note was short but powerful. "Jason, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I need you to know something. Sarah started seeing someone a month after you went to jail. His name is Greg Wallace. I think they were seeing each other before you got arrested. She told people you were a monster, but something about it never sat right with me. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner." Jason read the letter over and over until the paper nearly tore. Greg Wallace. He knew the name. A friend from church. A buddy who used to come over for football games. Someone Jason had shared beers with, laughed with. He remembered catching Sarah smiling a little too long when Greg was around. But he never suspected anything. Now it all made sense. The distance. The coldness. The fabricated story. The journal. The tears. She had planned it. She needed him out of the picture. And she knew exactly how to do it. And now she was living a brand new life with the man she chose over him. In the house he built, raising the children he could no longer see. Jason had 10 years to sit with that betrayal. To feel it crawl under his skin like a slow-burning fire. The only thing that kept him sane was one unshakable belief. One day he would get out. And when that day came, he would make her pay. 2 years after Jason's conviction, Sarah Collins legally changed her last name. She became Sarah Wallace, proudly taking on the name of her new husband, Greg. Greg Wallace had once been just a friend of the family, the type who helped mow lawns, came over for barbecues, and laughed with Jason over beers while the kids played in the yard. But now he was Sarah's savior, or at least that's how she described him to her friends. "He helped me through the hardest time of my life," she often said. "He saw what Jason was doing and never turned his back on me." To the outside world, Sarah's story was one of tragic survival and redemption. She had bravely testified against an abusive husband, protected her children, and rebuilt her life with a man who truly loved her. Together, she and Greg bought a new home in a quiet neighborhood just 15 miles from where she and Jason had once lived. the same town, the same people, but a very different narrative. Greg quickly stepped into the father role. He enrolled the kids in private school, coached Little League, and even got a promotion at his job in construction management. Neighbors admired the couple. They seemed strong, united, the embodiment of moving on. But not everyone bought the story. Wendy Mercer, the neighbor who once lived across from the Collins home, couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off. She had seen too much, heard too much. She remembered the months leading up to Jason's arrest. Sarah smiling too brightly at Greg when Jason wasn't looking. Late-night visits, whispered phone calls, and the way Sarah never quite looked frightened until the day after Jason was taken away in handcuffs. And now the two were married, living openly, as if none of it had ever been a secret. Meanwhile, in prison, Jason kept receiving updates from Wendy, brief, cautious notes hidden inside book covers and old magazines. She didn't know how much help she could be, but she knew she had to try. Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. Every new detail she sent him carved deeper into the part of him that still hoped for peace. By the 7th year of his sentence, Jason had stopped believing in justice. The appeal system had failed him. His own lawyer had given up. His kids didn't write. His parents had passed. All he had left were the memories of what his life used to be, and the images of Greg Wallace playing house with his family. Then came the day he had waited for, parole eligibility. Jason had been a model inmate. No fights, no infractions. He had completed anger management, parenting courses, even helped other inmates learn to read. The parole board saw a man who had changed. What they didn't know was that Jason hadn't changed at all. He was just waiting. In his final meeting before release, one of the parole officers asked him, "What do you plan to do when you're out?" Jason smiled thinly. "Start over." On a warm August morning, Jason Collins walked out of prison after serving 9 years and 4 months. No press, no welcome home, just a bus ticket, a duffel bag, and the memory of a life that had been stolen. He knew exactly where he was going, and exactly what he was going to do. Jason didn't return to his old neighborhood right away. He spent his first few days out of prison at a halfway house in Columbus, quietly adjusting to the outside world. Everything felt louder, faster, different. Smartphones had changed. Cars were quieter. Even the way people looked at each other seemed to have shifted. Eyes glued to screens instead of faces. But Jason wasn't overwhelmed. He wasn't lost. He was focused. He spent his nights walking the streets, rehearsing what he would say if he ever saw Sarah again. Would he ask why? Would he scream? Would he just stare at her and wait for the guilt to crack her mask? No. Jason didn't believe she felt guilt. Not anymore. Not after what she did. By the end of his first week out, Jason made a quiet trip to the town he once called home. He wore a hat pulled low over his face and sunglasses, just in case. He wasn't ready to be seen, not yet. He parked 3 blocks away from his old house. It wasn't his anymore, of course. It belonged to Sarah and Greg Wallace now. The paint was new. The shutters were blue instead of green. A swing set had been added in the backyard. His daughter's old tricycle was gone, replaced by 2 brand new bikes. Jason stood across the street, hidden by a tree, and watched as Greg pulled into the driveway in a shiny white truck. Moments later, Sarah walked out of the front door. She looked different, thinner, more polished. Her hair was shorter now. She held a toddler in her arms. A boy Jason didn't recognize. His stomach twisted. A child. Not his. Greg kissed her on the cheek, then took the boy from her arms and laughed as he spun the child around. The scene played out like a postcard of the American dream, and Jason watched it all like a ghost. Everything they had, everything she had taken from him was now hers to keep, and the man who helped her do it was living his life without a single consequence. Jason turned away. He didn't go back to the halfway house. He checked into a cheap motel just off the highway. He paid in cash, and that night he didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a single question burning in his mind. What would justice look like now? Because the law hadn't helped him. The courts had failed. The truth had been ignored. Now justice would have to come from him, and it wouldn't be clean. Jason woke up the next morning with clarity. The rage that had churned in his chest for nearly a decade had crystallized into something colder, something that felt like purpose. He didn't rush. Revenge, he decided, had to be measured, deliberate. One mistake, and everything he had endured in prison would be for nothing. He had to plan this right. No witnesses, no room for error. He began with surveillance. Each day, Jason returned to the neighborhood. He kept his distance, never staying more than 15 minutes. At first, he came on foot, then later used a borrowed bicycle. He memorized the family's routine. Greg left the house around 6:45 a.m. sharp in his truck. Sarah took the younger child to daycare at 8:15, then returned alone. The two older kids, his kids, boarded the school bus at the corner of 83rd and Maple around 7:20. By 8:45, the house was usually empty, except Fridays. Fridays were different. Greg worked from home. Sarah stayed in. They had coffee on the porch together, talked, laughed. It was almost worse than catching them kissing. Jason began to follow Greg too. One day he tailed him to the gym, another to a hardware store. Greg didn't look over his shoulder once. Why would he? He thought the threat was gone, locked away for good. Jason, however, was more careful. He slept in a different motel every other night, paid with cash, used burner phones, and stayed off the grid. He shaved his beard, dyed his hair darker, and even wore glasses when near the neighborhood. No one recognized him. No one saw Jason Collins. They saw a man in a rush, a stranger passing through. But Jason saw everything. He knew when Greg would be alone in the garage. He knew when Sarah would be in the shower. He even knew the exact moment the alarm system was disarmed for the dog to be let out. Each detail became a puzzle piece, slowly forming a deadly picture in his mind. But he didn't just want to kill them. He wanted them to know why. One night, Jason sat at the motel desk, scribbling in a journal he hadn't touched since prison. On the page, he wrote a simple sentence. "This is not revenge. This is balance." He repeated the line again and again until the words lost shape. The next day, he walked into a hardware store 20 miles outside town and bought gloves, duct tape, a crowbar, and a tarp. He smiled politely at the cashier, paid in cash. No one asked questions. No one remembered his face. He was ready. But first, he needed to say goodbye, not to anyone else, to himself. The evening air was unusually still. Not a single gust of wind moved the tree branches above the quiet cul-de-sac. Porch lights flickered on one by one as dusk settled in, and the hum of televisions and distant laughter floated through open windows. Jason waited in the shadows across the street, crouched behind a cluster of trimmed hedges. He had parked the stolen car 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance in silence, dressed head to toe in black. He wore latex gloves beneath leather ones, and inside his backpack were the tools he had so carefully selected. Duct tape, a hunting knife, and the pistol he'd bought off a former inmate 3 weeks earlier. Tonight wasn't about fear. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about clarity. He waited until 10:12 p.m., when the last light in the Wallace house went out. He gave them another 15 minutes, just to be sure they were fully asleep. Then he crossed the street. The side door wasn't locked. Jason had known it wouldn't be. Greg always forgot to check it after letting the dog out. Jason had observed the habit for over a month. He slipped inside, closing the door silently behind him, and moved through the laundry room and into the kitchen. Every step was practiced, controlled, surgical. The knife was in his left hand, the pistol in his right. He made his way to the stairs, bypassing the creaky 3rd step by stepping over it, another detail he'd carefully noted. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was lit only by the blue glow of a nightlight plugged into the wall. The door to the master bedroom was half open. Jason stood there for a moment, listening, breathing. He could hear the rhythmic hum of Greg's snoring, Sarah's softer breaths. For a moment, the past collided with the present. The image of Sarah lying beside him in that very bed, her hand curled against his chest, whispering promises in the dark. Lies, every one of them. Jason stepped inside. Greg stirred first. By the time he opened his eyes, Jason was already at the foot of the bed, the gun aimed directly at him. "Don't move," Jason said flatly. Sarah jolted awake at the sound of his voice. Her scream caught in her throat when she saw him. The face she had erased from her life, standing before her like a nightmare, returned. "Jason," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer her. He tossed the duct tape toward Sarah. "Tape his hands. Now." She hesitated. Jason cocked the gun. "Tape his hands." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she obeyed, her hands shaking violently. Greg tried to struggle, but Jason kicked the nightstand, sending a lamp crashing to the floor. "Don't test me, Greg. You already took everything." When Greg's wrists were bound, Jason stepped forward and duct taped his ankles. Then he looked at Sarah. "You'll get the same unless you sit down and shut your mouth." Jason's voice was calm. Too calm. He pulled a chair from the corner and placed it in front of the bed. Then he sat. "You lied," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "You told them I hurt you, that I hurt the kids, that I was a monster." She was sobbing now. I had to, Jason. You don't understand. You sent me to prison for 10 years. His voice rose now, cracking slightly. 10 years, Sarah. For something I didn't do." She opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off. "I watched you marry him. I watched you raise our kids like I never existed. And you never once looked back. Not once." He turned to Greg. "You were supposed to be my friend." Greg tried to speak, but the tape over his mouth muffled the sound. Jason stood, gun in hand, shaking now, not from fear, but from fury long restrained. He raised the pistol and fired. The sound exploded in the room like thunder, followed by the shriek of Sarah's scream. Greg's body slumped onto the bed, blood pooling beneath his head. Sarah fell to her knees, her screams raw and animalistic. "Please, please, Jason, don't kill me. Please." He looked at her, face unreadable. "I already died. You just never noticed." And with that, he pulled the trigger again. The silence in the house was deafening after the shots. Jason stood still, breathing heavily, staring down at the chaos he had created. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. He didn't feel satisfaction, only emptiness. He turned and walked out without looking back. By the time the neighbors heard the gunshots and called the police, Jason was already gone, disappearing into the night like a shadow. The bodies were found the next morning when a neighbor came to drop off a borrowed lawnmower. The front door was ajar. Inside, blood had dried into the carpet, the stench already starting to fill the air. Detectives arrived to find no forced entry, no signs of struggle, only cold execution. It didn't take long to figure out who had motive. Jason Collins. Jason kept moving. He switched vehicles twice, used a fake ID, and paid cash for everything. He knew the system, it had chewed him up once. He wouldn't let it happen again. But staying invisible in a world full of cameras was a losing game. He wasn't running from justice. He was running from finality. News of the double murder spread quickly. Local media painted Jason as a vengeful ex-con who snapped. Authorities launched a multi-state manhunt. The FBI got involved. His face was everywhere. The once quiet man became a national headline. But Jason had learned patience in prison. He could wait. He could vanish. For now. Was Jason a monster or a victim? Some saw a broken man pushed too far. Others saw a killer trying to justify his crimes. But one truth was inescapable: the system failed somewhere. And in that failure, 2 people died. Jason Collins was found 6 months later, hiding in a cabin in Montana, alone and gaunt. He didn't resist when the marshals came. He simply said, "Took you long enough." At trial, he showed no emotion. He didn't deny what he did. He didn't beg for forgiveness. When asked if he regretted it, he responded, "I regret trusting the wrong people, not how I fixed it." He was sentenced to life without parole. But in the court of public opinion, the story never ended. Some called him evil. Others, a man destroyed by betrayal and a broken justice system. His children, now older, remained silent, caught between 2 shattered versions of the truth. And somewhere in a concrete cell, Jason waited again. This time not for freedom, but for peace.